Have you ever wondered why you're always told never to bend between your legs in the river? What's the big deal? Or have you felt that burning curiosity to try it out for yourself, just to see what happens? Well, trust me, you are not ready for what's about to happen when you do. For over 8 years now since Solomon and Deborah got married. For a long time, they have prayed for a child, but as the years passed without an answer to their prayers, they hoped for it. The villagers often spoke kindly of them, but there were whispers, too, whispers that maybe the gods had turned their back on the couple. But as the months passed, there were new whispers. This time it was maybe their sins have been forgiven. On a beautiful morning, everything changed. Deborah felt a strange warmth in her heart. Other times she would always hope for her baby, but suddenly miscarriage would always be her excuse. But this time, before she knew it, she was holding a tiny baby girl in her arms. Solomon, who had been by her side, stared at the baby in her hand and smiled. "She is a gift," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Our daughter, our rejoice," he added, smiling into the babe's eyes. That evening the village gathered to celebrate the birth of the long-awaited child. Rejoice's arrival brought joy not only to her parents but to the whole village. They were all excited that the couple had finally been blessed with a child. Deborah, the gentle and kind-hearted woman, cherished her daughter from the very first moment. She never left Rejoice's side, always nurturing her with love and care. Solomon, the strong and respected man, vowed to protect his only daughter forever. "No one will harm you, my princess," he said, his voice filled with determination. "You are our precious gift." As Rejoice grew up, it became clear to everyone that she was not just an ordinary child. She was beautiful, with bright eyes and a smile that could light up a room. But more than that, she was special to her parents. Solomon and Deborah treated her like a queen, and in their eyes, she could do no wrong. They constantly reminded her how lucky she was to have been born to them, and as their only child, she received all their attention and love. As Rejoice grew older, she began to show signs of her strong-willed nature. Unlike the other children in the village who respected their elders and worshipped the traditions, Rejoice questioned everything she was asked to do. Her parents, Solomon and Deborah, never rebuked her. If she misbehaved or broke the rules, they would quickly step in and smooth things over, defending their precious daughter. "She's just a child," they would say with a smile, brushing off the concerns of the other villagers. By the time Rejoice was 12, she had become the most difficult child in the village. While the other girls' child participated in the regular chores and helped with cleaning the palace grounds, an important duty for girls of her age. Rejoice refused. "Why should I clean the palace, when I have no part in the royal family?" she would argue. Her defiance was met with nothing but smiles and pleasure from her parents, who never enforced any real consequences for her behaviors. Solomon, proud and protective of his daughter, often warned the villagers, "Never touch my daughter. She is under my protection." Deborah, too, stood by Rejoice at every turn, making sure no one punished her, no matter what she did. But things started to change when the king called all the young girls of the village to gather for a special task, something that had to be done for the benefit of the kingdom. It was a tradition, one that no one dared to defy it. Yet, Rejoice, feeling as though the rules didn't apply to her, refused to participate, much to the dissatisfaction of the other girls in the village. That evening, as the village buzzed with anticipation, the king himself called for an audience with all the young girls. Rejoice, however, stood her ground, and what she said next would shock everyone. The royal guards escorted the young girls into the palace courtyard, where the king sat majestically on his wooden throne, surrounded by his council. The girls lined up respectfully, their heads bowed in obedience. All except Rejoice. When the guards informed the king that Rejoice refused to join the group, he commanded her presence. Solomon and Deborah, hearing of the situation, rushed to the palace to defend their daughter. When Rejoice finally arrived, her defiance was on full display. She stood tall, her arms crossed, refusing to bow like the others. "Why have you refused to join your peers in this task?" the king asked, his voice calm but firm. Rejoice leaned to her jaw defiantly. "I see no reason why I should clean the palace. It is not my duty. I am not a servant, nor do I owe anyone my time," she declared, her voice echoing through the silent palace yard. Breaths filled the air as the council of elders exchanged uneasy glances at each other. Even the other girls were surprised by her boldness. The king's eyes narrowed, his face unreadable of the boldness of such a little girl. "Every girl in this village must contribute to the traditions of our land," the king replied. "Your refusal is not only disrespectful to me but also to our ancestors. You must apologize and join your peers." But Rejoice stood firm. "I will not," she said, her tone unwavering. Deborah quickly stepped forward. "Your Majesty, please forgive her. She is young and does not understand the ways of the world yet," she pleaded, her both hands held together, her voice trembling. The king turned to Solomon. "You have raised a child with no regard for our tradition, no respect for the elders. If this continues, it will bring confusion to our village," he warned. Solomon, unwilling to admit his fault, said, "Rejoice is my only daughter, and no one will force her to do what she does not want to do." The king remained silent for a moment before addressing his guards. "Leave her be for now. But remember, no one is above the laws of this village, not even the daughter of Solomon." As Rejoice and her parents left the palace, murmurs spread through the crowd. But one of the council members leaned in to whisper to the king, "This girl's arrogance will lead her to ruin, Your Majesty. It is only a matter of time." That night, Rejoice sat outside her home, her gaze fixed on the moonlit sky. She didn't know that her boldness had set off a chain of events that would soon test her in ways she could never imagine. The village buzzed with whispers the next morning. Rejoice's defiance at the palace had become the talk of the village. While some admired her courage, many saw it as a dangerous challenge to the traditions that held the community together. That afternoon, the herbalist, Elder Gideon, arrived at Solomon's compound. He was a wise man with silver streaks in his beard, known for his deep connection to the gods and the river spirits. Deborah hurried to welcome him, her heart pounding with unease. "Elder Gideon," she greeted nervously. "To what do we owe this visit?" Gideon's eyes fell on Rejoice, who sat under a mango tree, sharpening a stick without a care in the world. "I have come to warn you," he said gravely, his voice carrying a weight that made Solomon step outside. "Warn us about what?" Solomon asked, folding his arms defensively as he walked out to meet Elder Gideon. "Your daughter," Gideon replied, his gaze never leaving Rejoice. "Her pride is becoming a threat, not just to your family but to the entire village. The gods do not tolerate arrogance, especially from the young ones. You must teach her humility before it is too late." Rejoice scoffed loudly from her spot. "The gods should worry about bigger things than me," she said, tossing the stick aside. "Rejoice!" Deborah exclaimed, her face pale with fear. Gideon frowned deeply. "You mock the gods, child, but they see everything. If you continue down this path, the consequences will be beyond what your parents can protect you from." Solomon stepped forward. "My daughter is under my roof, and I will deal with her as I know it's right. The gods have no business punishing her when she has done no harm to the tradition." The herbalist shook his head slowly. "The gods do not wait for harm to be done. They act when disrespect becomes a disease. This is your final warning." As Gideon left, Deborah clutched Solomon's arm. "Solomon, I fear for her. Maybe we should talk to her, make her understand the tradition," she whispered. But Solomon waved her off. "She is just a girl, Deborah. The gods will not waste their time on her." Rejoice, overhearing their conversation, smirked to herself. "They're all scared for nothing," she muttered. "Stay out of trouble, Rejoice," Deborah had said, her voice trembling. Her father Solomon had nodded, unusually quiet, his distant gaze. Little did she know, her defiance was already setting events in motion that would change her life forever. On her way to the river later that day, she heard faint voices from behind the large tree. Curiosity got the better of her, and she crept closer, only to overhear two elders discussing her disobedience behind the tree. Rejoice bent down behind the tree, listening secretly to the elders' heated conversation. Their voices were low, but the frustration in their tone was clear. "This generation has lost all respect," Elder Chijioke muttered, a wiry man with a sharp tongue. "Girls like Rejoice are the root of the village's disobedience. Her parents are to blame for always shielding her." Elder Matthew, the oldest and most respected of the group, sighed heavily. "The gods won't look kindly on her arrogance. She defies tradition as if it's a joke. If Solomon and Deborah don't rein her in, there will be consequences in the future." Rejoice, face burned with anger. How dare they speak of her this way? She clenched her fists, her temper rising with every word from the elders. "Times have changed," Elder Obi added. "If she continues this way, the council might have to intervene." At that moment, Rejoice couldn't hold herself back any longer. She stormed out from her hiding spot, her voice cutting through the quiet evening like a lash. "Who do you think you are to speak about me behind my back?" The elders turned, startled. Elder Matthew's eyes narrowed. "This is not a place for children, Rejoice. Go home right now." Rejoice scoffed, folding her arms defiantly. "Children? Is that what you call the future of this village? Maybe if you spent more time fixing real problems instead of gossiping about me, the gods wouldn't be so angry." The audacity of her words left the elders speechless. Even Elder Chijioke, who was rarely at a loss for words, gaped at her in disbelief. Elder Matthew finally spoke, his voice steady but laced with warning. "Be careful, Rejoice. Your mouth will lead you to a path you cannot return from." But Rejoice smirked, her arrogance unwavering. "Maybe if you elders weren't so afraid of change, this village would be better off." As she walked away, her heart pounded with a mix of anger and satisfaction. But the ripple of unease she left in her wake hinted that her words might have set something dangerous into motion. The village hummed with rumors of Rejoice's latest behavior. Everywhere she went, whispers followed her, but she ignored them, carrying on disregard for everything as though she was untouchable. Elder Chijioke's warning replayed in her mind, but she dismissed it as the talk of an old man trying to scare her while her parents had promised to always show up for her as their only child. That evening, Rejoice's father, Solomon, arrived home earlier than usual. His usually warm expression was tense, his brows furrowed as he settled into his chair. Deborah, ever watchful, noticed his mood. "What's troubling you?" she asked, handing him a bowl of steaming soup. "The elders," Solomon began, his voice heavy, "they are saying our daughter insulted them in public. They claim she disrupted their meeting and refused to apologize." Deborah's face hardened, her hand trembling as she handed him a bowl of water to wash his hands. "And what did you tell them? You know our Rejoice isn't one to tolerate nonsense." Solomon sighed. "I told them I would speak to her, but Deborah, this is getting out of hand. The king may hear of this, and you know he won't be as forgiving as the villagers this time." Rejoice, overhearing their conversation from the doorway, stepped into the room. "Why are you worried about the king? He's just another man like the rest of them," she said boldly, folding her arms. "Rejoice," Solomon snapped, his voice unusually sharp. "The king is not just another man. He is the custodian of our traditions and the peacekeeper of this village. Your disrespect is putting us all at risk." Deborah intervened. "Don't raise your voice at her. She has done nothing wrong. If the elders can't handle a little truth, that's their problem. Let my daughter stay in peace." Solomon looked at his wife in disbelief. "Deborah, your constant defense of her is why she behaves this way. Can't you see where this is leading her?" Rejoice smirked. "Where it's leading to? Is nowhere. No one in this village can touch me, and you both know it." But her father's next words caught her off guard. "The elders plan to petition the king tomorrow. They want him to intervene directly. You wait till then." Rejoice froze for a moment, then laughed. "Let them. The king has more important things to worry about than intervening in what happened between the elders and me." Despite her boldness, unease crept into her heart. That night, as she lay in bed, she thought about Elder Chijioke's ominous words and the growing tension in the village. The next morning, Rejoice arrived at the river. She stood firmly by the river, her friends gathered around her, their faces filled with a mixture of fear and concern. The herbalist, a respected elder of the village, had just finished performing his sacred ritual at the darker side of the river. He muttered ancient words, his body bent low in reverence, as the river seemed to respond with a calm that almost felt supernatural. Rejoice watched her defiance grow with every passing second. The ritual had always interested her, this secret power, the connection with the gods. But more than anything, it made her angry. Why did only the herbalist get to do this every time? Why was he the only one with the power, the one who could call on the gods, while she, Rejoice, the daughter of the village's strongest couple, had to sit back and watch? I can do that too, she whispered to herself, a bold smile creeping across her face as she walked into the river. Her friends, Rose and Lily, quickly grabbed her arms, pulling her away from the river. Rejoice, don't even think about it, Rose warned, her voice laced with fear. You don't understand the ways of the gods. Rejoice pulled her arm free from them, shaking her head. I know exactly what I'm doing, she snapped. You just watch me perform. Ignoring their pleas, she stepped forward, walking confidently towards the very spot where the herbalist had just stood. Her friends begged her to stop, but it was of no use. Rejoice was determined to imitate the herbalist. Rejoice bent over the river, mimicking the herbalist's every movement, as her friends begged her to stop. They knew the power of the river and the gods it held, but Rejoice was too proud to listen. I can do this too, don't get scared, she muttered, her voice filled with confidence and arrogance. Her eyes lowered down, focused on the river between her legs, just as the herbalist had done before her. For a moment, the world around her seemed to pause. The wind stilled. The trees calmed. And then, everything changed. Suddenly, she could not straighten herself. No matter how hard she tried, her body remained bent, as if a powerful force held her in place. Her muscles screamed, but she couldn't move, and the pain began to rush through her legs at that moment. The air grew thick, scary, almost supernatural. Rejoice's eyes widened as the waters of the river shone before her, and to her shock, she saw the gods of the land gathered in a magnificent feast, sparkling, delicate beings dressed in flowing robes, their voices blending in joyous celebration. Their laughter echoed around her, but it was distant and cold. Then, out of the corner of her eye, she saw something, an old mermaid, rising from the depths of the river. Her ancient, wrinkled face twisted as she turned to lock eyes with Rejoice, her expression darkening. You dare, the mermaid hissed. With a wave of her twisted hand, she called out to Rejoice's spirit, her voice like the winds of a storm. Before Rejoice could react, she felt her spirit leave her body. Her spirit was pulled out of her very soul, trapped within the ancient power of the river. Her body remained bent, lifeless, her face frozen in panic as the river gods continued their feast, unaware of the torment she had caused. The children who had been playing near the water witnessed the terrifying sight. Their laughter died in their throats as they saw Rejoice, motionless and trapped in her unnatural position. Fear swept through them, and they ran to the village, shouting for help. Something is wrong with Rejoice, they cried, rushing to the elders who were just passing. Within minutes, a group of villagers arrived, panic rising among them. The king, along with several elders, followed closely behind, their faces grave with concern. They stood at the riverbank, watching in silent horror as Rejoice remained bent, unyielding, and still. But it wasn't just the villagers who had come. Rejoice's parents were rushing toward the river, driven by panic. Her father, tall and proud, and her mother, with tears already welling down her face, arrived at the scene in the river. Rejoice, her mother cried, her voice breaking as she knelt beside her daughter, reaching out to touch her. But Rejoice did not respond. She was pinned in place, her eyes wide and unblinking, unable to speak, unable to move. Not long after, the herbalist arrived at the river, his both arms folded as he fixed his eyes on Rejoice's lifeless bent body. The herbalist, who had witnessed such things before, began chanting, his voice low and steady as he prayed to the gods, begging for mercy. He begged them to release Rejoice, to return her spirit to her body, to forgive her for her reckless rebellions. Please, mighty gods, release her, he pleaded, his hands raised to the sky. But the gods remained silent. The river stirred but gave no answer even when the herbalist began crying on Rejoice's behalf to the gods. As the hours passed, The villagers and the king watched in sorrow, their pleas for mercy falling on deaf ears. Rejoice's mother wept uncontrollably, her hands shaking as she held her daughter's unmoving form. But nothing changed. The storm that had raged earlier began to die down, and the sky turned dark, signaling the end of another day. It was then that the herbalist turned to the crowd. "We must leave," he said, his voice heavy with defeat. "The gods have spoken. There is nothing more we can do tonight. We must return tomorrow if only the gods will have a change of mind." Reluctantly, the villagers agreed to leave, leaving Rejoice's mother at the riverbank, crying out for her only daughter. As they all slowly walked back to the village, the scene by the river grew strangely quiet, the air thick with unanswered questions. That night, the village was restless, haunted by the memory of what they had witnessed. And the burning question lingered: would Rejoice ever be freed from the river's grip? Would she ever speak again? The night passed in uneasy silence, the air thick with fear and anticipation. Rejoice, mother, still at the river, had not slept a moment. Her eyes were swollen from hours of crying, her heart torn with worry. The sun was barely peeking through the horizon when the herbalist, Gideon, arrived again with his apprentice Peter the next morning. They walked in solemn silence, their faces grave, knowing that the gods had claimed Rejoice's spirit. By the time they reached the river, a heavy fog hung in the air, obscuring the sight of the river. The herbalist immediately knelt by the water, his hands trembling as he began his sacred incantations, his voice low but steady. Peter, standing behind him, watched nervously, his mind racing with questions about what had happened to Rejoice. The young herbalist had never seen anything like this before. The river was calm, but its silence felt uneasy. The air was thick with tension as Gideon, the herbalist, stood beside the river, his hands raised to the heavens, his voice a low, steady chant. The river seemed to respond to his every word, ripples forming in the once calm water, stirring as if the gods themselves were waking from their slumber. The villagers gathered at a distance, murmuring quietly, their eyes glued to Rejoice's form still bent in place, frozen and unmoving. Gideon's chants grew louder, more urgent, as he called out to the gods, pleading for mercy. His apprentice, Peter, stood close by him, his face pale with fear. The storm clouds above seemed to respond, darkening the sky as a low rumble of thunder echoed from the mountains. The villagers stood still, watching, holding their breath. Everything seemed to pause, waiting for the gods' decision. Then, in one moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. The thunder roared, louder than before. The wind whipped through the trees. Gideon raised his arms high, his voice now pleading in desperation, "By the mercy of the gods, let this child be forgiven. Let her spirit return to her. Let her body be free from the curse." After a long terrifying moment, nothing happened. The world seemed to stop. The only sound was the rush of the river against the stones. Then, with a sudden crack like thunder, the water of the river began to churn violently, splashing in all directions. Rejoice, still bent, let out a soft, strained gasp, and for a split second, her body trembled. The villagers held their breath in shock. And then, she fell to the shore of the river. The young girl, still bent in a strange, unnatural way, collapsed toward the riverbank. Her legs were stiff, and her body dropped like a limp doll, landing heavily on the muddy shore. The villagers gasped, eyes wide with disbelief. Her mother, Deborah, screamed and ran forward, but she was too far away. Her heart pounded in her chest, her breath quick as she rushed to her daughter's side. From behind where the herbalist told her to stand, a shout rang out, a powerful, urgent voice that belonged to Rejoice's father. Rejoice! Solomon, her father, came running, pushing past the villagers, his heart pounding in fear. His eyes locked on his daughter, who was lying motionless, crumpled at the water's edge. Her eyes, wide and unblinking, stared blankly at the sky, and her mouth was slightly open as if she had been struck dumb by an unseen force. Her once beautiful face was now empty, as though her soul had been lost. Deborah reached her first, falling to her knees beside Rejoice, her hands trembling as she tried to lift her daughter's head. "Rejoice, speak to me, my daughter," she cried, shaking her shoulders. But there was no response. The girl did not even blink her eyes. Solomon dropped to his knees beside them, his hands desperately searching for any sign of life, but to no avail. "Rejoice, can you hear me?" Solomon's voice cracked with emotions. He turned to the herbalist, his eyes wide with disbelief. "What have you done to my daughter? What is happening to her?" The herbalist stood silently, his face grim. "I did what I could, Solomon. The gods have spoken. She was too proud, too defiant. They have forgiven her, but her spirit—" Gideon paused, unable to finish. He had done all he could, but now, Rejoice was left in a state no one had prepared for. Rejoice's body lay limp in her mother's arms. Her father's hands shook as he touched her cold skin, his heart breaking. There was no movement, no sound. It was as though she were no longer truly alive. The villagers whispered, some fearful, some uncertain. What could be done now? Was there still hope for Rejoice, or was this the price of defying the gods? The herbalist knelt by the water, his hands pressed together in prayer. The gods have spoken, but they are not kind. This is her fate. The gods have taken her spirit, and with it, her ability to hear, to speak, to live as she once did. She is lost to us now. Solomon stepped forward, his face pale. Can't you do anything? Eyes of the gods, is there no way to bring her back to us as she was? His eyes searched through the crowd, looking for answers, but the villagers could only watch in silence. There was no simple solution to this curse. Their eyes remained on Rejoice's unblinking eyes, wide and empty. What had been a beautiful, defiant girl was now a hollow shell, her fate sealed by her pride. The villagers could only wait, hoping that the gods would find mercy once more. But with each passing minute, it seemed less and less likely. The sun was setting as Rejoice's lifeless form was carried home by her father. The villagers watched in silent disbelief as the proud man, who had once been so full of authority and strength, now trudged through the dusty road with his daughter through over his broad shoulder. Her body was limp, and her once beautiful eyes stared ahead, wide and unblinking, as if she could see something beyond this world, something far behind imagination. Her father, Solomon, walked with heavy steps, his face drawn and tired, his heart heavier than it had ever been. The pain in his chest was unbearable. He had always thought he could protect her, his only daughter, the jewel of his life. He had thought that his power and influence could shield her from the consequences of her actions. But now, as he carried her home, he knew better. As he reached their compound, the villagers parted, their eyes filled with pity and fear. Solomon's wife, Deborah, rushed out, her hands trembling as she saw her daughter in her father's arms. She collapsed to her knees, tears welling down her face. "No, no," she cried, her voice choked with agony. "What have we done?" Solomon gently placed Rejoice on the mat outside their house, his heart aching with every breath he took. He looked down at his daughter, her once beautiful face now a mask of emptiness. His pride, his love for her, had only led to her downfall. "I should have listened to the elders," he whispered under his breath. "I should have protected her differently." The villagers began to gather around, their whispers like the rustling of leaves in a dark forest. The king had sent word to come, to offer condolences, but all they saw was the broken shell of a girl who had once defied every rule, every tradition. The youth, those who had once admired Rejoice for her beauty and rebellious spirit, now stood in silence, watching with wide eyes. They knew that this tragedy was a lesson for them all. Rejoice's pride had brought her to this moment, but it was also a reflection of the village's collective arrogance. They had allowed her to grow up without understanding the true meaning of respect. They had allowed her to walk a path that was destined for ruin. And now, they would have to live with the consequences. Solomon stood tall despite his broken heart, looked at the villagers, his voice steady but filled with regret. "Let this be a lesson," he said, pointing to his daughter. "Let this remind us all that no one is above the gods, and no one is beyond their reach. Our pride, our arrogance, has cost us dearly." The villagers stood in silence, reflecting on his words. Rejoice's fate was a powerful lesson, not just for her, but for all of them. No one was invincible, no matter their beauty, status, or pride. The gods would always find a way to humble those who thought they were untouchable. As night fell that day, the villagers returned to their homes, but the weight of what had happened lingered in the air. The king, who had watched from a distance, stood with his head bowed. He understood now that the power he had once held was nothing compared to the power of the gods. And he, too, had learned that lesson too late. In the quiet of the night, Solomon and Deborah sat beside their daughter, their hearts broken but filled with the same sorrowful understanding. Rejoice, the girl they had once adored, was gone. And in her place was a lesson they would never forget. Sometimes, we must learn the hardest lessons the hardest way. The story of Rejoice teaches us that no matter how much we believe in our strength, the gods and fate have the final say.